Good evening, everyone. I invite you to participate again during the lecture and discussion, and share your wisdom with everyone who's in attendance. This is where we left off last week. I was just trying to convey the idea that as we have become more and more productive in the design and creation of technologies and our different tools, we as workers using these tools have also increased our productivity, based on the efficiency that we learned to use these tools and technologies. And so, if you think about that, that's one reason why real wages have increased for many people, not for everyone, but for many people. And so you have to think about labor markets in a sense of what causes some people to receive a higher level of wages, or as Henry George might describe it, a higher percentage of their true wages, or a greater percentage of their true wages. Why do some people receive more than 100% of what they actually produce, and others much less than 100% of what they actually produce? And so that's where we get, I would argue, in the realm of externalities based on government, on law, and public policy. This is a chart that shows what's happened in the United States to this idea of real wages adjusted, for the CPI. And while nominal wages, as you can see here in 2005, crossed over the real wages and continue to go up, the purchasing power of those wages has actually fallen. The organization Redefining Progress did a similar analysis and came up with the conclusion that real wages in the United States, directly related to the well-being of households, has fallen ever since the 1970s. The chart that I'm showing here was accompanied by an article written by a man named Jeff Nielsen. And here he explains what the data is telling him. He writes, using the year 2000 as the numerical base from which to zero all of the numbers, real wages peaked in 1970 at around $20 an hour. Today, the average worker makes $8.50 an hour, more than 57% less than in 1970. And since the average wage directly determines the standard of living of our society, we can see that the average standard of living in the US has plummeted by over 57% over a span of 40 years. For a lot of people, that's certainly true. For others of us, our nominal incomes have increased sufficiently to overcome inflation and price inflation. So for us, our standard of well-being has kept pace, or maybe even been better. There are, as everyone here, I'm sure, has experienced, there are expenses in our standard of living that have gone way up, particularly energy, food, medical care. And so each of us in our society is experiencing a different level of wage loss of our purchasing power of our wages, and whether or not we're having a declining, stable, or increasing standard of well-being. This is a photograph just to show that one of the great externalities that affect the quantity and quality of wealth that's produced by us are disasters. And natural disasters, for example, destroy enormous amounts of what we produce. Yet the basic distribution of wealth is governed by the fundamental relations we described last week. So you have these natural disasters, and they can destroy an entire community's capital infrastructure. How does that capital infrastructure then get replaced and rebuilt? It is rebuilt by the need for people to work and produce more wages, and those wages have to be distributed in a way that they'll be available to replace the destroyed infrastructure. So we see that all around the world, with regard to the changes in climate and the increased frequency of disasters, and how much tangible assets are destroyed, and what it's going to take to rebuild those communities. Henry George offers this insight into this particular dynamic. He says, where land is free and labor is assisted by capital, wages will consist of the whole produce, less what is necessary to induce the storing up of labor as capital. Where land is subject to ownership and rent arises, wages will be fixed by what labor could secure from the highest natural opportunities open to it without paying rent. That is the margin of production. There's still free land available. In fact, I think I mentioned last week, we've had circumstances here in the United States where communities that have been losing population, where there's not enough employment, or the social environment just isn't stimulating enough, that young people leave and businesses then follow as these communities decline in population. Well, they've advertised, free land. If you come and agree to live here, we'll give you a piece of land free that you can build a house on. George goes on to say, where all natural opportunities are monopolized, wages may be forced by competition among laborers to the minimum at which they will consent to reproduce. And here again, it's another dynamic. If as George is arguing, if there's a high degree of land monopoly, then there's not much opportunity for people to be self-sufficient. They're going to have to work for wages. And so you're going to have a greater competition for the employment opportunities that are available, and that will drive wages down. And that's all he's really trying to say. So I'm ending, this is the end of the fifth lecture, and then we'll go on to lecture 6. But these are the final points that I didn't get to make last week. So George described natural laws as laws of tendency. And so what I've tried to cover is some of the externalities that affect the outcomes. So while there's a strong tendency for wealth to be distributed directly back to labor, capital, and land, whatever system of law is in place can't affect exactly how that distribution occurs over how it would be distributed under natural circumstances. And government, in my view, at all levels is a strong externality. And how government raises its revenue is at the top of the list of how those tendencies are interfered with, either positively or negatively, from the standpoint of the wages that come back to labor. Okay, so that's the end of that fifth lecture, and now I'm going to begin the sixth one. So now we'll go on, and we're going to examine the natural laws of distribution and how they operate. And so this part of the lecture should help to add some clarification. And at the same time, again, we look prescriptively at the outcomes and we have to apply moral judgments regarding the equity and fairness of those outcomes. So philosophically, I would say the distinction in this analysis is between questions of what is and questions of what ought to be. So we can talk about, the world as it is, and we want to always keep in mind that what we're shooting for is a world where the outcomes are just and consistent with objectively derived moral principles. So a little bit of history here as to where this all comes from. What we know about the behavior of ancient groups is that they migrated as their sources of food diminished, as weather patterns changed, as they had internal disputes and had to split up, and as external threats appeared, or as signs from the gods directed them. So people today continue to move from one place to another for similar reasons, with some limitations, because the world's divided up into nation states with borders, and we are, in almost every nation state, we are trying to enforce borders to prevent people from coming in illegally. And one reason I would argue that we are so concerned about this is that every society, to one degree or another, exists in an environment of scarcity. There's a concern, about, is there sufficient work available for people? Are immigrants coming in, and are they competing unfairly to take away employment from people who are already here? Are new immigrants putting increased pressure on our environment? All of these issues come into play. And George argued that there's no direct correlation between population size and poverty. That if we had just systems of law, and if rent was publicly collected and we were able to eliminate other taxation, that we would welcome all newcomers, because there would always be an expanded level of opportunity for people who are coming in. Within every society that I've studied, eventually, the word eventually is important here, eventually there emerges three distinct subgroups. And you can it's pretty easy to figure out how that happens. In the early groups, you had people who were in charge of going out and hunting for game, bringing back the food source, had to go out before agriculture and forage, and so bringing back the food. There were knowledge bearers. The knowledge bearers were people in the community, in the society, who were astute at looking at their natural environment and figuring it out a little bit better than others. They had a sense, by looking at the stars, by looking at nature, of when are the seasons going to change? How can we predict adverse weather coming? What about the movement of animals that we need to have? And so those knowledge bearers gained a degree of authority within society, and eventually they developed into a priestcraft and used their insights, their knowledge of the physical environment, as a way to bring reward to themselves, intellectual power within the community, as well as the potential to ask from those who produced the food and other goods for a significant share of what was being produced in return for their role in that society. And the same with the hunters who became warrior protectors. And over time, you can see it, that tribal organizations that begin and with a communitarian type structure with no hierarchy, eventually all yield to some sort of hierarchy in their development. And hierarchy transfers authority sanctioned by the gods as communicated through the priestcraft. So if those in the community are claiming that they're able to talk to the gods and they're getting divine direction, then it's tough for others to challenge that, particularly if those individuals, have a frequency of being correct. If they learn basic ways to use nature to heal illnesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So eventually we get warriors turning into an oppressive class within the community. Warriors will begin to develop their own rituals, their own subgroups, separate and distinct from the rest of the community. And so warriors become oppressors. We see the development of aristocracy, and in most societies, it's the aristocracy in league with the priestcraft. And who's at the bottom of that ladder? It's the people who produce for that society. Then you move to a next stage of increased population, and over time, the consolidation of power over the population meant control over territory becomes extremely important, and control over everything that occurs within that territory. So you need borders to be protected, and the interests of those close to those who govern nurtured and supported. Regulation of trade and commerce to limit competition and reward loyal supporters became an ingrained responsibility and power of those who govern. And how do you enforce this? You enforce this by all sorts of ritual, of deeply entrenched tradition, and coercion. So fast forward a bit. As wars were fought in the old world, meaning your part of the world, Michael, and others who are on, these are done to consolidate minor fiefdoms into nation states. And as this process is occurring, beginning, you might say, with the Renaissance, or Renaissance, I think is the European pronunciation. Writers on political economy tended to defend the idea that national strength required a closed economic system, that the nation must be as self-sufficient as possible, and that self-sufficiency required the establishment of colonies from which raw materials could be drawn and to which finished goods sold. And ideally, all goods would be carried on ships owned by the interests in the mother country, and this system became known as mercantilism. This is how the global economic relationships have evolved. And only slowly but surely over time has there been an appearance of cracks in this system of mercantilism. So Henry George, in his criticism of mercantilism, wrote this. He says, "The truth is that merchants and manufacturers, as merchants and manufacturers, are not the ultimate beneficiaries of the protective system, and that mercantile interests can long profit by it only when sheltered behind some special monopoly." He adds, "This has been shown in the United States, where the owners of coal and mineral and timber and sugar land have constituted the backbone of the political strength that has carried protection to such monstrous length." And so he writes this came from the Science of Political Economy. So it's important because here we are in 2024, and we have in many countries a return to this mentality of we must be able to produce so much for ourselves, particularly those goods that are necessary for our defense militarily, because we don't feel we can depend on foreign sources of certain raw materials that are necessary for national defense. And so there's a certain justification made for protecting some of those industries. Now, I don't know what the justification is for protecting the sugar producers in the United States, but there are still a good deal of protection against the importation of sugar here in the United States. And depending upon the constituency of a given Congress member of our U.S. Congress, they're going to do everything they can to protect whatever monopoly privileges that exist for the producers that are located in their geography. So again, the laws of production and distribution are subject to externalities, and so therefore they are laws of tendency. Now, George himself, interestingly, believed in protectionism when he was a younger man. And he, as I remember, he abandoned his belief in protectionism after hearing a lecture by one of the leading protectionist defenders. And he just came away from that saying, you know, if what he's saying is true, then we should be building a giant wall around our country and not let, you know, any goods come in whatsoever. Because if some protection is good, then absolute protection must be better. So after discarding the protectionist views he embraced as a young man, Henry George consistently championed free trade. However, free trade meant, in his thinking, that government had the essential responsibility to secure and protect what he called, quote, a fair field with no favors. I think that comes from cricket, English cricket. So George is calling for a fair field with no favors, elimination of privilege, elimination of subsidies, all of that. And with this regulatory environment established, he believed the benefits to all of a healthy commerce would be realized. And he expressed it this way. He says, while diversities of climate, soil, and geography at first separate mankind, they also act to encourage exchange. Commerce also promotes civilization. It is in itself a form of association or cooperation. And he believed, of course, that to the extent free trade prevailed, that it would prevent warfare or have a significant impact on stimulating people in societies who are engaged in commerce with one another to pressure their governments not to engage in warfare. George came to the conclusion that there's a great harmony between the free exchange of goods and political liberty. And here's what he said about that particular point. Modern civilization has gone so much higher than any before due to the great extension of association, not just in larger and denser communities, but in the increase of commerce and the numerous exchanges knitting each community together and linking them with others far apart, and also in the growth of international and municipal law. I think that's getting to the point. Advances in security of property and person, strides in individual liberty, and movement towards democratic government. And so, you know, George would probably be listening to the current, you know, debate over protection of intellectual property rights between many countries and the Chinese.
Yes.
And we need, you know, these are treaties that need to be negotiated and then international law agreed upon and enforced. Well, Henry George, he reaches this basic axiom about human behavior in an economic sense. He says, political economy proceeds from the following simple axiom: people seek to satisfy their desires with the least exertion. And one consequence of that is the tendency to monopolize natural opportunities. Locke did his best to try to give us some guidance on that. I mean, he made this great effort to distinguish our behavior as being part of liberty or in the realm of license. And I think he did an adequate job in talking about criminal behavior, but he didn't go so far as to really deal into economic relationships in the same sense that he did with behavior that was an attack on someone's, you know, person. And this is where I think Henry George picks up on. He picks up and goes from there. This is just, a little somewhat humorous sign I've made, to demonstrate what George is saying, that we exhibit a strong tendency to attempt to monopolize access to nature and resist competition. Do owners of business really relish competition as a stimulus to innovation and efficiency? Or do they just say, oh no, I've got all these competitors out there, I really have to work hard. If I could hire some lobbyists to get some protection under law, then, I could make adequate, returns without this kind of stress. So, this is just the sign I would put up, expressing what George is saying about us. This part of the world is mine. I inherited the deed given to my family by the government after the indigenous people were removed. Go steal your own land from someone else. I have weapons to defend my claims and will use them. That seems to me a fairly accurate description of our views in highly evolved Western societies regarding property rights to nature. You may or may not think it's too harsh, but I think about in the United States, for example, the people out in the West who have had easy access to the public domain for generations and had to pay very low fees for grazing their animals or water rights, etc. And they basically have developed an attitude of, even though that is part of nature and is part of the public domain, that they have some special claim to it by virtue of the time that their family has been there after the indigenous people were driven away. So again, just getting back to Adler and Alec, Adler is one of the philosophers I feel who has done the best to take very difficult to understand philosophical positions and put them in language that most of the rest of us can understand. And he observed that in a society governed by just law, citizens would enjoy leisure, time to engage in civic affairs, and possess goods sufficient for a decent human existence. He basically said to us, we may not know what a just society is, but if we look at the members of a society and we see that they enjoy the goods of a decent human existence, including these things we don't often think about: leisure, time to engage in civic affairs, good medical care, access to education, then we live in, by virtue of those characteristics, we live in a society that is relatively just. And he says this as well: the size of a population directly affects the division of labor that is possible in a community, and indirectly its productivity of consumable wealth, the means of subsistence. But productivity is also affected by the technology available. A more populous community with a primitive technology may be less productive than a less populous community with an advanced technology. The productivity of a community determines the amount of wealth available to its members and the amount of human time that can be freed from toil or subsistence work. And from his perspective, that is the evolutionary goal of a society as it advances, to free us from toil or subsistence work so that we can engage in these higher level kinds of activities that at least, those of us here pretty much are able to enjoy. Not all people around the globe have the luxury that we have of being able to engage in this kind of discourse. I don't know, what's your reaction to what Adler is telling us, what his perspective is here? But here's a couple points that Henry George made that I think are still worth considering, that you will find a little bit hard. You won't agree with him, I'm sure, Will. He says the size. Oh, I'm gonna get. Where am I? I'm lost my track here. Okay, I gotta go back. Okay. The size of a population directly affects the division of labor that is possible in a community, and indirectly its productivity of consumable wealth, the means of subsistence. But productivity is also affected by the technology available. A more populous community with a primitive technology, again, may be less productive than a less populous community with an advanced technology. The productivity of a community determines the amount of wealth available to its members and the amount of human time that can be freed from toil or subsistence work. So again, he's trying to help humanity get away from having to manually dig ditches, manually having to do that lowest level of effort that should be done by technology, so that that laborer could then maybe become a pipe fitter or a welder or something else, but not having to spend time on something that could be done, by machinery and technology. At least I think that's what he's getting at. The ultimate message I get from what we've covered in this, section from Henry George is that we have these natural inclinations to behave monopolistically and to use the force of law to create privileges for ourselves if we can get away with it. And so for those of us who are trying to find our way to contributing to movement toward a more just society, he's asking us to look very deeply at how we're organized. And he makes the observation that where there is widespread poverty, where there are periodic business depressions and prolonged unemployment, the one thing we can be certain of is that the division of labor is not fairly established, that there are free riders. There's a redistribution of wealth from producers to a rentier privileged class. Next challenge is what must be done. And so that's where we will pick up this discussion next week.